All right, big topic today, guys. Signal processing. Let's move forward with it. So, what is signal processing? Signal processing is modifying a signal to turn what you have into what you want. And this is what defines the sound of a producer or engineer. Categories of processes. You're going to hear these terms thrown around by engineers all the time. We got to know what they mean. There are frequency domain processes, time domain processes, and dynamics processes. All right. Frequency domain processes do the following. They change the fundamental, that is the pitch that you can sing back on a sound, or they change the balance of the harmonic content of your signal. Every naturally occurring sound is made up of many building block sounds called sine tones. And every sound has a mama sine tone called the fundamental frequency. And then above and below that fundamental frequency are sine tones that have certain relationships to that fundamental that either reinforce the fundamental or not. When the fundamental is reinforced, you get a musical sound that you could sing back, a pitched sound. When you do not reinforce the fundamental, you get something that is a noise. But apart from that, the balance of these sine tones, the overtones and undertones around the fundamental define a sound's timbre. And when you modify the harmonic content of a sound, you change its timbre. And so frequency domain processes either change your perception of the fundamental or it changes the harmonic content of the sound, the balance of overtones and undertones over the fundamental. Time domain processes changes the timing of a signal when a signal is sent out or your perception of where a signal was recorded. Right? Dynamics processes change the dynamic range of a signal. It's the difference between the softest sound in the signal and the loudest sound. So dynamics processes either reduces the difference between the lowest and highest sound or increases the difference between the softest and loudest sound. Today, we're tackling the ones that you're going to work with the most in every audio application. Moving forward, we're going to tackle equalization first. Okay, EQ. What is EQ? EQ changes the harmonic content of your sound. It changes the mix between your harmonics, partials, and undertones. Subject on EQ, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about EQ filter types, and you'll hear engineers talk about this using the terms curves. Whenever you hear an engineer use the term EQ curves, they're talking about EQ, equalization filter types. And then the second half of the conversation on EQ focuses on device or plugin categories, and we're going to look at two of them. All right. Now, EQ curves are made available in certain plugins or device types. So again, don't confuse the two. Peaking filters, bell curves, bandpass, these are the most common filter types. They have parts. We have the center frequency, which defines around where you're going to start cutting or boosting. We have the bandwidth, which is how many frequencies to the side of the center frequency are you going to modify. All right, and this is controlled by the Q control, which has an inverse relationship to the bandwidth. Don't worry, I'm going to show you some visuals. And the peaking filters or bell curves can be used for cutting or boosting bands of frequencies, but just an FYI, anything other than gentle cuts or gentle boosts with wide bandwidths will yield an unnatural sound. All right. Now, when you only choose to filter, cut, or boost very narrow bands around the center frequency, almost honing in on a single frequency, that's called notch filtering. That's a special term for a very skinny bell curve. It's good to repeat it. The wider the bandwidth, the more natural your cut or boost will sound. The narrower the bandwidth, the more unnatural your cut or boost will sound. But it's also good to mention the amount of boost or cut will also determine the naturalness of your sound. What you guys are looking at is Adobe Audition. Let's see how this how peaking filters work. But in order to do that, I need to record a little bit of my voice here. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. All right, guys. This is my parametric equalizer. Let me just explain this graph a little bit. Here, this blue line is called the zero line. The zero line. All right, and your bell curve is going to occur above or below that line. If you apply a bell curve above, you're boosting a band of frequencies. If your bell curve occurs below the line, then you are cutting a band of frequencies. On this side, we have a amount of decibels in boost, and here on this axis, we have our frequency. And so what I'm going to do now is select a center frequency to work with. Filter number 3, so I'm going to grab this. That is a bell curve. That is also a bell curve, and you can see why it's called a bell curve. Again, remember, it's also called peaking and bandpass. All right, so right now, I have a bell curve that's boosting around the center frequency of 814.4 hertz. All right, and I'm applying a 3.2 dB boost on that frequency. Now you see that the bandwidth is pretty wide. If I wanted to reduce the bandwidth, that is not grab so many frequencies to the side of 814 hertz, then I would go to the Q control of my bell curve, all right? And the Q control is here. See where it says Q and width? Now, you have to remember, guys, that Q has an inverse relationship to bandwidth. So the smaller your number, the bigger the bandwidth. The larger the number, the smaller the bandwidth. So if I wanted to do really, if I just wanted to grab a few frequencies to the side of 814 hertz, then I would take this up to like maybe 40 Q. And you see how the bandwidth narrowed. This would be considered to be notch filtering. Testing 1, 2, 3. All right. And let's loop you. Okay, it should be ready. Testing 1, 2, 3. Let's add some fizz to this. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, back to flat. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing some more body and middle range. 2, 3. Again, I want something natural sounding, so I'm 1, 2, 3. Fattening up the voice in the middle range. Testing 1, 2, 3. And then add some fizz. Testing 1, 2, 3. See, and testing wide bell curves. 1, 2, 3. All right, wide bandwidth, testing moderate boosting will give you natural sound and help you to avoid distortion. I can take this into distortion if I go all the way up here in the stratosphere. 1, 2, 3. You want to avoid the red in your peaking filter down here. I mean, in your peaking meter down here. About high pass and low pass filter. By the way, high pass equals low cut filters, and low pass equals high cut filters. So what are these guys designed to do? They are designed to cut entire ranges of frequencies, but the cut, which begins at the threshold, is introduced gradually. Again, we're going to go back to my parametric equalizer so that you can see a high pass and a low pass filter. Now, boosting a range of frequencies with a high pass or low pass filter is not recommended. Again, high pass and low pass are designed for cutting, designed for attenuating. Anything but minute boosts can lead to distortion. If you want to boost an entire range of frequencies without risking distortion, then that's when you want to use shelving curves. Now, shelving curves, when you look at them, they have a similar shape to high pass and low pass filter, except the threshold is a brick wall, and this gives you headroom for more boosting. All right, you can do really drastic boosts with shelving curves. The EQ actually that's built into your car stereos are shelving curves, because while you're driving, you go to your car EQ and you're not really paying attention and you make really drastic changes. But those drastic changes, you'll notice in the car, don't usually lead to distortion. That's because what's built into your car stereo are shelving curves. They are designed for drastic boosting of a particular range of frequencies. So what if I wanted to eliminate plosives in a vocal mic, for example? Plosives. I can apply a high pass filter, and you see that the threshold is a gradual ramp down. All right, plosives. I'm going to apply a threshold at 80 hertz first and see if I can get rid of it. Let's see. Oh, yeah. All right, there's my 80 hertz. Okay. Oh, 85.7 hertz threshold. Plosives. I can do still more cutting to get rid of it. 157.7 hertz. Plosives, plosives, plosives. Okay, greatly reduced. You know, you record, you mic the guitar amp, and the guitar amp sounds like this. Shh, there's a lot of hiss on it. All right, you can eliminate that sound, eliminate those high frequencies, whereas you're just getting the sound from the guitar.
Note, this isn't the only solution to clean up hiss in a recording. Whenever you use EQ for audio cleanup, you are most likely degrading the quality of your recording. A better solution for removing hiss from a recording is to use an audio cleanup plugin that allows you to isolate the noise and remove it from your recording. If your DAW doesn't have a cleanup plugin, then you can download Audacity for free on SourceForge.net and use its high-quality audio cleanup plugin. Work with its controls until you get a clean sound without any artifacts. This cleanup method requires preparation. However, make sure to record a few seconds of your noise before you begin tracking.
Okay, types of EQ devices. We've been looking at the parametric EQ. Parametric EQ is a device or plugin that allows you to exert control over every EQ parameter of a filter. It even allows you to combine filter types. Now, parametric EQ looks different when it's available on a console. Expensive consoles, expensive mixers have parametric EQ built into the channel strips, but of course, all of the controls are available as potentiometers. So the interface, of course, is different, but you have similar control to what you have inside of a plugin. Now, graphic EQ doesn't allow you to exert as much control over your EQ. It was developed for live sound reinforcement. It was designed to help you make quick and dirty EQ fixes during a live sound setting. It basically looks like a mixer. Graphic equalizers look like a mixer, and you have a line of faders, and each fader represents center frequencies of bell curves whose bandwidths are unadjustable. They're set. You can't play with the Q of your bell curves in a graphic EQ. And so what's the bandwidth? Well, the bandwidth on each center frequency, around each center frequency is set so that every bell curve overlaps the other. So the overlapping bell curves help you to create a natural sound so long as you're only doing minor cuts and boosts on the graphic EQ. Again, if you want an unnatural sound, it's very easy. All you have to do is make drastic changes on the graphic EQ and you will get that. Now, in a live sound reinforcement kind of deal, you can use graphic EQ to ring out mics and monitors. Let's go to Audition's graphic EQ. All right. Now here in Audition, I have the choice between a 10-band graphic EQ, 20-band. The largest graphic EQ that you can work with is a 30-band graphic EQ, and this covers your entire hearing range. Every fader on your graphic EQ represents a center frequency. Now you cannot change these center frequencies. Here, you're dealing with a 500 hertz center frequency. Here, a 630 hertz center frequency. Here, you cannot adjust the center frequencies. You got to work with what's there. Each one of these bell curves has unadjustable bandwidths. You cannot adjust the Q on these bell curves. And you have to be aware that the bell curves overlap each other. So if you make gradual changes to the graph here, you get a more natural sounding EQ. All right, let's see how this guy works. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. So you hear big boosts with graphic EQ give you unnatural sounding
Testing 1,
sound.
2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
And major
Testing 1, 2,
drastic boosts can
3.
lead, as you saw there, to distortion. All right. So again, it's very easy to distort and to go unnatural with a graphic EQ. To fix problems, you want and to keep a natural sound, you just want to make minor boosts or cuts in your graphic EQ. When it comes to ringing out mics and monitors, again, you make a cut until you no longer hear the feedback frequencies, but you don't want to completely cut out a feedback frequency because then you'll get an unnatural sound coming through your monitors, which will bother your musicians. So what is compression? Compression is a process that reduces the dynamic range of a signal. And under what circumstances would you need to reduce the dynamic range of a signal? Anyone have any ideas? Let me give one prime example. Vocals. Now we know that the human voice is comparatively a weak instrument and it has trouble competing with other instruments in an ensemble. The thing is, it's also a very dynamic instrument, meaning that the softest sound that a vocalist can produce and the loudest sound a vocalist can produce is quite a big range. And so it can be kind of unwieldy, a kind of difficult to be able to boost a vocalist above the other members of the ensemble with such a big dynamic range, because in one section of the piece the boost may be adequate, but then in the parts where the more intimate parts of the song where they're not belting, for example, the boost will not be adequate and the other instruments entirely mask the vocalist. And so what one can do, and guys, this is usually a problem in commercial type music. You would rarely apply compression in a classical track. In classical music, usually an ensemble, including the vocalist, balances themselves. So we're talking more commercial applications. There are exceptions to the rule, of course. So in order for the vocalist to compete with the ensemble, and this usually applies to an ensemble that needs artificial balancing, like a jazz ensemble, like a rock ensemble. In order for the vocalist to compete with the ensemble throughout the track, through the soft parts and the loud parts of the vocals, you reduce the dynamic range so that you have more control over the mix. Compression is a tool that you turn to a lot. And one of the reasons you turn to it is to have full control over your mix by reducing the dynamic range of an instrument that has a huge dynamic range. Okay, so controls of a compressor. Now, not all compressors will have these controls. Some, depending on the plugin, they may even rename or combine controls. But laying it in the most basic way, all compressors have these parameters. All right, you have your input gain. Now, input gain during a recording, if you're applying compression during recording, the input gain should be controlled by the input gain on the instrument. If you're dealing with a microphone, your preamp levels. All right. If you're dealing with a synthesizer, the input gain should be determined by the volume on the instrument. But if you're compressing with a pre-recorded sound and you need a little bit more oomph in that sound, then you would adjust the input gain on the compressor. Ratio control. You'll hear a lot of people say, well, this is what determines how harsh your compression is. That is a false statement. These upper three controls, input gain, ratio, and threshold, are interactive, and all of them together determine how harsh your compression is. In the early days of radio, before compressors were available, before they were invented, but when a host or a speaker got too close to the mic and started laughing and making loud sounds, you would have an engineer writing the fader somewhere in the session, adjusting the volume manually. Compressors still work that way. When they hear a signal that passes a certain threshold, they lower the volume quickly, except compressors. So it's not an automatic, compressors can't tell the future. During a live recording session, when something passes a threshold, then they react. And so how quickly a compressor reacts to a signal is set by the attack time, and how when to let go and allow a signal to return to unity is determined by the release time of a compressor. Ratio, we can't explain ratio without talking about threshold. All right. Threshold is when the compressor comes into play. All right. Something that really digs deep into the waveform would be represented by numbers like minus 25 dB or minus 30 dB. And so I'm gonna pull up a compressor for you, and you'll be able to see this visually. But it's gonna work more when that threshold line is closer to the zero line of your waveform. So the further away from the zero line of your waveform, compressor's not gonna work too much. The closer comes to the zero line of your waveform, the more your compressor is gonna go to work. All right. Now, say you set your threshold. Now, how much squash after your signal passes a threshold is determined by your ratio settings. A 1-to-1 ratio setting means no change. Nothing's happening to your signal. 2-to-1, for example, means the following. Say your signal passes the threshold, and this is the simplest way that I can explain it. Say your signal just passes your threshold by 2 dB. Well, then your signal gets squished down to 1 dB above the threshold. With 3-to-1, if say your signal passes 3 dB above your threshold, then it kicks down your signal down to 1 dB above the threshold. Say 5 to 1, 5 to 1 ratio. Say your signal simply passes the threshold by 5 dB. Then it squishes down your signal down to 1 dB above the threshold. Now, of course, when you're dealing with a real signal, and also depending on your threshold settings, you're going to have way more than just 1 dB past the threshold. But it's proportional, you see. The higher your ratio number, the more of a squash you're going to get. Now, here's the thing. Say you want a mild threshold setting. You set it to minus 10 dB. Very mild threshold setting. But then after you do that, you raise the input gain on your signal. When you do that, you're effectively lowering the threshold. You're making more of the waveform pass the threshold. And so you want to make sure to have full control over your compressor, you apply your input gain first and then leave it alone. And then work with your threshold. Don't go back to your input gain after you've set the threshold. Okay, so all of these three things work together to give you how intense your compression is. It's bad to think, or not bad, but inaccurate to think, oh, 15 to 1 will give me a super squished sound. Well, maybe. It depends on where your threshold is and what your input gain is. All right, now, after you compress something, the gain of your signal is reduced. So to bring something back up, you have to apply some output or makeup gain. So this is another parameter that's available in most compressors. So here are my vocals. Again, here, vocalists will probably be heard well in the mix. Here, probably not. So we're going to even out this waveform to make it easier to mix over the ensemble. And again, with vocals, not residual, side benefits to compressing vocals is some more presence in the mix, a thickening of the voice. But again, pops and sibilants can arise after you compress a vocal. And of course, you can fix that through EQ or through another type of compressor called a de-esser. So let's apply compression. And I'm going to use the waveform editor here so you can actually see the change in the waveform. Here. All right. And I'm going to choose my tube model compressor. All right. And look, here are my controls. Threshold, output gain, ratio, attack, and release. All right. With vocals, you want to keep a pretty quick attack and a medium release time. Now, according to what we see here with the threshold, output gain, and ratio, is any compression going to be applied to the vocal? No, everything's going to pass through. Now, one thing that I need to explain, when you look at a peaking meter or a VU meter that's inside of a compressor, it's actually working in reverse. You will only see this peaking meter or your VU meter in a compressor work when your compressor is actually doing something, when signal has passed the threshold. And the more the signal passes the threshold, the more activity you will see in your peaking or VU meter. So let's take a look. Won't you tell him, please, to put on some speed? No compression is happening here. My lead, oh, how I need. All right. So let's add a medium threshold around minus 24 or minus 25. Okay. So I'm going to cut down into the waveform more. I'm going to have a ratio of 4 to 1, which is where most engineers start with vocalists, is a 4 to 1 ratio. I'm going to leave the attack time alone, leave it to be quick. And I'm going to have the output gain, let's see, I think 12 dB will take me back to a level that I want to be at. So I'm going to play the compressed version and I'm going to bypass it. And then I'm going to apply it through the process so you could see physically how the compressor is changing the shape of the waveform. All right, so here is no compression. Won't you tell him, please? Won't you tell him, please? And here is with compression. Won't you tell him, please, to put on some speed? Follow my lead, oh, how I need someone who'll watch over me. All right, and I'm now going to apply the process so that you can see the change in the shape of the waveform. So see how much dynamics we have in the original waveform. You'll see how this evens out. Now you see how there is much less of a difference between this part of the waveform and the rest of the track. So you see our compressor has evened out the waveform. And again, not residual, but side benefits. Please. Thicker voice, more present voice.
Speed. Note, compressing vocals can also cause problems. It can boost plosives and sibilants, which can make the vocals uncomfortable to listen to. Plosives can be fixed with a high-pass filter with a roll-off between 80 and 150 hertz. Sibilants is fixed using another type of compressor called a de-esser.
Processes related to compression, limiting and peak limiting. Limiting is an extreme form of compression. Some engineers say that once you pass 50 to 1, you're limiting. Other engineers will say, no, it's after you pass 100 to 1. I mean, it doesn't matter. Extreme compression is limiting. With some limiters, after a sound passes a threshold, the limiter like slams down on the sound, doesn't allow anything else to pass the threshold at all. Whereas compressors, you still have a little bit passing the threshold, and how much depends, again, on the ratio settings. But with some limiters, and depending on these on the ratio on the limiter, you have like a club beat down all the peaks of your waveform so as not to pass the threshold at all. So limiting is severe compression. Now, peak limiting is where you set a limiter or a compressor to only respond to the peaks of a waveform. This allows you to preserve most of the dynamic range of your signal, but you just have some protections against clipping.
It matters, however, where the peak limiter is in your signal chain. It only works to protect from clipping if your mic signal's passing through a limiter before it gets converted into digital audio for your DAW. Applying a peak limiter in your DAW will not fix an incoming signal that is clipping.
All right. Now, the opposite of compression, where compressors and limiters reduce your dynamic range, expansion devices increase your dynamic range. It makes your louder sounds louder and your softer sounds quieter. It increases the differential between the loudest and the softest sound in your signal. Now, the most common type of expansion device is your noise gate. And the way that a noise gate actually works, noise gate is used to eliminate quiet noises in your sound. So in the old tape days where you would record something and everything sounds nice and clean while the band is playing loud and proud, but then when the band is playing, softer parts of the track, you hear the tape hiss in the back. So that would be eliminated with a noise gate. A noise gate, being an expansion device, has controls that are similar to that of a compressor. It also has a threshold setting. And so, but the threshold setting works in reverse in a noise gate. Anything below the threshold gets cut out. How does it get cut out? Well, anything that lands below the threshold in the noise gate gets infinitely expanded. It's made quiet to the point where you can't hear it anymore. It attenuates the sound below the threshold to the point where you can't hear it anymore. So that's how a noise gate is an expansion device. Okay, so moving on to time domain, the most popular time domain processes, reverb and delay. Reverb devices or plugins imitates the reverberant qualities of a space. In the old days, before we had computers and plugins and stuff, when you wanted to add reverb into a track, you needed something called an echo chamber. So a studio would either build a dedicated echo chamber or usurp a stairwell in the building that the studio's in and set up microphones in certain key areas in that chamber. Then they send the original signal through speakers in that chamber, and then what the microphones would do would be record the reverberated sound. And then that recording would be mixed into the track. Moving forward in time, studios graduated to reverb boxes. For example, plate reverb. If you can't have a dedicated echo chamber in your building, you would buy a huge box with a bunch of plates, metallic plates in them, that basically would work the same way as an echo chamber. There would be you send the original signal through the box, and you have microphones in there record the reverberated sound through the box, and then add it to your mix later. Spring reverb imitates a plate reverb would do, but of course, it's basically a recording of a resonating metallic spring, which gives you a way more twangy metallic type sound, an unnatural sound. But that's how reverb, analog reverb, was created, by actually recording something that's physically reverberating. In plugins, you don't even need two separate tracks to mix your reverberated sound and your original sound together. Everything is done within the plugin. You can control the mix between your reverberated sound and the dry sound right in the plugin. Delay is often confused with reverb. Delay in its purest form is a copy of the original signal sent out at an interval that you define. Great for creating rhythms, but the reason why people confuse reverb plugins with delay plugins is because you can imitate reverb if your delay plugin has feedback settings and filters that allow you to degrade copies of your signal over time. Inline routing versus parallel routing. So here's the signal flow for inline routing. This is basically, these two terms delineate where apply a process in the signal chain and what the recording device gets. All right. So inline routing, you go from sound source to the process, whatever process you're adding, and then the recording device only gets process signal. An example of when you would probably do this type of routing, this very simple routing, is with guitar effects. If you're recording a track where the effects on the guitar are part of the sound of the guitar, and you basically don't want any of the unprocessed guitar ending up in your recording, you would apply inline routing. So basically, an example of this would be guitar through some kind of pedal and then into your recording device. That would be an example of inline routing. Parallel routing is the following. You have the sound source passing through the process, but you also have the sound source without the process. And then recording device receives the mix of the processed sound and the unprocessed sound. So parallel routing is when the recording device receives a mix of processed and unprocessed sound source. And as with the example of reverb, all right, you can control the mix of the processed and unprocessed sound source by, for example, making a copy of the processed signal, of the original signal, and then processing that 100%, and then inside your DAW, mixing the levels between the two to get the desired mix. Or you can do the entire mix, all of your parallel routing within the plugin itself, and on your DAW, your parallel routing would be hidden because everything is being done with a plugin on a track. Okay, so that would be an example of parallel routing. And again, some people may forget that they're doing parallel routing because, as with the example with a reverb, everything nowadays, the mix between the processed and unprocessed sound can be done within the plugin itself. And on your DAW, all you see is one track with the resultant sound. All right,